All right, good evening, everybody. We've got folks joining us. I know there's always a couple extra minutes before we can officially kick things off. But thank you all for joining us this evening on our last session of Constitutional Toolkit. Really happy to see all of you here. We're letting in a few extra folks. All righty. Well, in the interest of the fact that it is 3 minutes after 7, I'm going to kick us off for this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us for our 6th session of Constitutional Toolkit. As always, I want to introduce myself. My name is Emily Voss. I'm the Director of Education at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison Montpelier. And we have been co-hosting the Constitutional Toolkit series with the Center for Civic Education and their amazing leader, Christopher Riano. So thank you to Center for Civic Ed for working with us for this whole process. This has been a lot of fun. And we are really looking forward to crafting some sort of Constitutional Toolkit 2.0 at some point in the future. But we are not there quite yet. We still have our session this evening. And I am really excited about this one. I mean, we've covered a lot of issues. All of them are very much up to the minute, but I feel like this one in particular is so up to the minute, particularly as we've seen the controversies arising in the state of Georgia with a lot of corporations taking a stand pertaining to Georgia's voting restrictions or perceived voting restrictions. So tonight we are going to dig in, certainly not just to that issue, but to lots of others pertaining to the right to vote. So I am delighted to introduce to you our evening's scholar, Dr. Sandra Cosgrove. She is a history professor at the College of Southern Nevada and serves as the executive director of Vote Nevada, a nonprofit civic engagement organization. She received a PhD from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, with areas of specialization in the US West, Native American history, and Latin America. And currently, Sandra is actively involved in a wide range of different college services, including working through the Women's Alliance to deconstruct barriers that block women from success. And as the executive director of Vote Nevada, Sandra engages in community outreach, civic empowerment, and advocacy for civil rights. And so tonight I am eager to hand things over to Dr. Cosgrove to kick us off.
All right, thank you very much. I am super excited to be here tonight because just as Emily said, this is one of my favorite topics as well. And Nevada was one of the places that during this last election cycle, every time I would turn on the news, people would say, why can't they count the votes faster in Nevada? And then we would have to explain to people that we had to wait 10 days before we could actually release our numbers and that the calendar doesn't go faster. And so I spend a lot of time talking to reporters and talking to people who lived in the state because there was a lot of lawsuits and we had emergency election rules and it all got very confusing. And so what I thought I would do tonight in talking about voting rights is not just talk about the Constitution, which is extremely important because we've got suffrage amendments, talking about Supreme Court rulings, talking about the difference between what happens in Congress and what happens at the state level. But then also I want to bring up some of the questions that folks asked me in this last election cycle because it got very confusing and it got to the point people were emailing me and saying, I don't even know if I have a right to vote. Do I have a right to vote? And so, we needed to talk about whether people had a right to vote and whether it's unlimited or whether there's limitations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and pull it up here. And I'm going to go ahead and hide the panel so that I can see all my words. So what I want to do is I want to use kind of a legal term, laying foundation. So if you do mock trial, if you've ever been a judge with that, you'll probably hear a lot of times the judges when they're talking to students about how they crafted their case and whether they did a good job with argument, they'll say something like you did a good job laying foundation or you really need to work on laying foundation. And what that means is did you create the argument? Did you create that foundational argument that you could build on? And so what I want to do tonight is kind of lay foundation for the right to vote. So where does that right come from? Or again, I had people just asking me, do I have the right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide and start with defining terms and maybe making some assertions that folks were making to me. So oftentimes I teach at a community college, and if a student gets confused and they're asking me questions, one of the things I do is I say, well, let's kind of deconstruct the words that you're using. Let's make sure that you understand the terms. And then maybe when we do some definitions and we look at them kind of as just vocabulary words, it will help you to understand the argument. And then maybe you'll be able to make some assertions based on those terms and those arguments. So if someone said to me, do I have the right to vote? Well, what is a right? So what would be a common definition? If you looked it up in the dictionary, what would it say? So one of the common definitions of a right is a capacity of asserting a legally recognized claim. Well, now we have a term that's in there that maybe we need to further recognize or further define, and that's legally. So what does that term legal mean? So legal means deriving authority from or founded on a law. Okay, well then what is a law? How do we recognize a law here in the United States in American history? A law is formally recognized as binding or enforced by a controlling authority. So if we go back and we ask, do I have a right to vote? Using these definitions, most people would say, I do have a right to vote, because I can point to the US Constitution and I can show you where in the Constitution it creates limited right to vote. So I could point to some amendments where it says your right to vote cannot be denied based on race. And so there's a right to vote. It's limited, but there's a right to vote. I can also point to federal law that provides authority to enforce that limited right to vote. So I could look at the 1865 Voting Rights Act, and I would be able to say, or not 1865, but 1965 Voting Rights Act. And I would say, well, there's a law. Is it enforceable? I would look at the courts and I would say, I've got court cases that's affirming the federal government's authority to enforce those limited rights to vote. So if a person asked me, do I have a right to vote? We deconstructed it, looked at the words, then applied those words to American history, to the American law, to the American judicial system. We would be able to say you have a right to vote, but it's not an absolute right to vote. And this is why there always ends up being a lot of contention when we have elections that are very close. This is why we had a lot of lawsuits that were filed in this last election cycle, because there was a lot of emergency rules that had come into place. But in general, Americans do have a right to vote, but you need to understand what those limitations are and the way we kind of work through those limitations when something goes wrong. So let's look at the US Constitution. So when we're looking at that limited right to vote, it's not absolute, so there's limitations on it. When you look at the body of the US Constitution, you're not really going to see the right to vote talked about. Where you're really maybe sort of going to see a reference to it is in Article 1, Section 4. And this is where you talk about a right to representation. And why would a right to representation be in the body and not a right to vote? Well, it goes back to that saying that we're all taught in about second or third grade about taxation and representation. When the founders of this country got together in Philadelphia and they said, you know, we were sent here to maybe redo the Articles of Confederation, maybe amend them to fix them, and we don't think they're fixable, let's set them aside and see if we can do something better. They really didn't have authority to do what they were doing. They were kind of coloring outside the lines a little bit. And so they knew at the end of the day, when they were all done and they put their names on that parchment, they were going to walk out to a public that probably wasn't going to be happy with them. They were going to walk out to a public that maybe was going to be a little angry with them. And so they wanted to be able to come out and at least be able to point at the very beginning of the document and say, don't be mad. Look, right here, we took care of taxation with representation. So in Article 1 is where we're going to get the census, and it talks about representation. So in Section 4, it does talk about federal representation. So Section 4 talks about the times, place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the place of choosing senators. So right here, you have a reference to elections, and you have kind of a right to representation when it's connected to taxation embedded in the body of the Constitution, but it doesn't really say anything about the right to vote. It doesn't really say who should have the right to vote, or it doesn't even really say who decides who should have the right to vote, except for this reference to state legislatures. Why would they do this? By the time we got to the point that the founders are writing the Constitution, all the states, the 13 states, had their own state constitutions. They were doing widely different things when it came to voting in elections. And if they would have tried to figure out just one way, just pick one state and use that for the example, they would have spent the whole summer arguing about why they picked Massachusetts over South Carolina and why they couldn't go with Georgia instead of New Jersey. So instead, they said, what we're going to do is we're going to have this right to representation that people are going to be looking for. And then we're going to push down kind of the decisions and the rulemaking when it comes to elections and voting down to the state level. Let the states decide what they want to do. That way we don't have to argue about it. That way we don't have to come out and say that one state's going to be the way we're going to go and that another state is going to have to change. And so in the body of the Constitution, this is really all you see. That is not the case when you get to the amendments, because as time goes on, there's going to be a push, especially from the grassroots, that people are going to want to have the right to vote. So at the state level, white men without property, especially in those northern states, are going to want the right to vote. When we get to the end of the Civil War and we go into Reconstruction, the radical Republicans are going to want to enfranchise Black men. So when you look at the suffrage amendments, we do start to see the right to vote pop up. 14th and 15th, 17th, 19th, 24th, 26th. So all of these amendments in some way reference the right to vote. So your 14th and 15th amendments are your Civil War amendments, where you have Black men gaining the right to vote. But again, it's still kind of that limited right to vote because it's still going to be constricted by state legislatures and the rules of elections. 17th Amendment, 1913, is when we get direct election of senators. There was so much corruption in the US Senate during the Gilded Age that the senator from Rhode Island literally always called himself the senator from Standard Oil. And it was legislators at the state level that were appointing senators. And so there was all kinds of bribery going on, and there was just awful corruption in the Senate. So it was the progressives, they said, we need to make senators directly accountable to the people through elections. And so you do see the right to vote connected to the 17th Amendment. The 19th Amendment in 1920, women gained the right to vote. And again, I'm going to put an asterisk there because it's really kind of white women that gained the right to vote. Women of color, there were still lynchings that were happening in the South. There are still problems even in some of the northern areas where you would have literacy tests. And so it was still divided by a color line. The 24th Amendment will eliminate poll taxes as a barrier. You can't charge people for the right to vote. And then the 26th Amendment is going to be passed as we're into the Vietnam War, because we were drafting 18-year-olds, but then not allowing them to vote until they were 21. And so you had 18-year-olds saying, why can I have a rifle and go off and fight in a war, but you're not going to give me the right to vote the people who are sending me to war out of office until I'm 21. And so we do have amendments in the Constitution that do establish the right to vote, but in very limited ways. So when we're looking at federal law and the federal courts, you do have the 1965 Voting Rights Act is probably the one that people know best. There are other federal laws, but this is really the one where you're going to see a lot of interaction between the federal government and the states. So it empowers the federal government to enforce voting rights per those limits that are in the US Constitution. It will task federal offices and office holders with the Justice Department with enforcement, so that they can go into states and then they can strike down laws, they could change things. And it defined actions that were not allowed that would limit voting rights. So you can't have that poll tax, you can't have that literacy exam. And so it empowered people at the federal level through the federal government and those office holders with the ability to preemptively go into a state and stop actions that were going to limit voting rights. The federal courts also play a role in election and voting rights. So the US Supreme Court, it interprets the US Constitution and then oftentimes measured laws that are passed in relationship to that interpretation. And so if a law is passed in a state and some people feel that it's a violation of the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment, and they take that case up to the US Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court would then look at that law and measure it next to the interpretation of the US Constitution to determine whether it was constitutional. Federal courts oftentimes determine if federal rights have been violated when asked. And this was something that was confusing to some people that I talked to in this last election cycle, because they were seeing not just what was happening in my home state, Nevada, but they were watching what was happening in other states. And I'm even getting these questions now as, we're having kind of a conflagration in Georgia, and there's these arguments about what some people consider to be voter suppression. People will say to me, well, isn't that a clear violation of the Voting Rights Act or the 19th Amendment or the 24th Amendment? Why aren't the courts stepping in? And they're assuming that the courts can just preemptively step in and overturn a law. They can't do that. They have to be asked. A case has to come to them. And so somebody has to litigate and come before them and say, I have standing. I was harmed. I was harmed in some way. So I have the right to bring this case to you. And here's how I feel I was harmed. So the judge will be able to say, does this person have standing? Have they actually been harmed? And then based on the way they say they are being harmed, does this case have merit? Are they right in the argument that they've made? Because if you can't go into court and say you have standing and merit, your case is not going to go forward. And so when you look at the court cases, it's incumbent that the burden is on the person bringing the case and their attorneys. The courts can't just step in, even if there's some obvious violation that's happening. They have to be asked. The courts can order federal and state offices and office holders to follow the law. So if a case is brought, there's merit, there's standing, it's litigated, the judge agrees with the plaintiff and says there has been a violation, there's an order that's going to come forward. And I'm sorry, but there's a typo right there. But I was changing this to the last minute. If that order then goes out, and they can ask federal and state office holders to then abide by the law. So another question that folks asked me quite a bit was, how can I protect my right to vote? And so we were one of the states that decided to go with all mail-in voting, in addition to our regular voting procedures, which was vote in person on voting machines. And so I had people say, well, how do I make sure that somebody's not going to steal my ballot before it gets to me in the mail? How do I make sure that people are not committing fraud? I mean, there was all kinds of questions that people were asking me here in Nevada about protecting their right to vote. Well, one of the things that you can do, and I told people in this last election cycle, is in Nevada, we have a legislative session that's going to start in February. So we're right in the middle of our legislative session now, is you need to maybe exercise your right to representation and talk to the people who you elect at the federal and the state level and ask them to pass laws that protect your right to vote. So you can exercise your right to representation, and you can talk to your candidates who are going to run for Congress, the ones that just ran or the ones that's going to run next year, and ask them to please pass laws that protect your right to vote. Elect members of Congress that are going to promise you to pass laws that are going to protect your right to vote. And so what I would say is sometimes you need to vote to protect your right to vote. But what I ended up seeing a lot here in Nevada in some of these court cases is the court saying, we do think there might be a problem here, but we think that the body or the entity that needs to fix this problem is not the courts, but your legislature. The legislatures in the US Constitution, they have the power to fix and to change and to set election rules and election laws. You should really talk to your legislature and have them fix this, because we don't feel that the court should be doing so. So even if they find that maybe there might be something wrong, they will say, use your right to vote to protect your right to vote. And then if you're doing this, advocate for laws that protect voting rights. I mean, after you've done some research on the right to vote and how to improve voting rights based on the Constitution, maybe it could be based on your state's Constitution. A lot of states have constitutional provisions that protect the right to vote. Go and talk to the people that represent you. Talk to them about legislation that you would like to see passed. Do public testimony, send in your comments, make sure that you're talking to your neighbors, making sure that that piece of legislation gets through. So speaking with your members of Congress about specific voting rights laws can be helpful. And then ensuring state laws and voting rules also protect your right to vote. So vote to protect your right to vote, and then advocate, really become an advocate to protect your right to vote. So I had some people say, I don't really feel like my right to vote is being protected. Can I sue? What would I need to do to sue? And obviously the answer is going to be yes, but, or yes, it depends. As I've said before, if you want to sue, you can't just go into the court and say, hey, judge, I feel like my rights are being violated. You need to be able to go in, and your attorneys, this is why you hire good attorneys, need to be able to present a brief arguing that legally your right to vote has been violated. So when you're looking at maybe, what your constitutional rights are they absolute? No, it's limited. So if you're going to go into court and you're going to say that your right to vote has been denied, you have to cite that limiting factor. Was it based on race? Was it based on sex? Was it based on an inability to pay? Was it based on age? I mean, that's what you would do if you were going to cite one of the amendments. You might want to cite the 14th Amendment. You might want to say that there's an Equal Protection Clause violation. But you have to look at these limits that are there protecting your right to vote in the Constitution. And then you and your attorney have to go in and you have to convince the judge that what's happened to you fits within the parameters of these limited rights that are in the US Constitution. So let's say you feel like maybe that your right to vote has been denied based on race, that you feel like there was something that happened that is disadvantaging a historically Black neighborhood. So maybe you're going to go that your right has been violated based on race. What are your chances in federal court? So if you're going to go into court and you're going to cite the US Constitution, again, a judge is going to say standing and merit. Were you hurt? And a lot of court cases that happened in Nevada, the court actually said, were you hurt differently or were you hurt specifically? Because in one of the cases that happened here in Nevada, the judge actually said, well, we do agree that there's a problem here, but it's impacting everyone the same way. So you aren't being hurt differently or specifically. So we're not actually going to rule in your favor. You need to talk to your legislators. You need to do something else in order to fix this, but we don't feel that you were singled out or we don't feel that you were hurt differently than someone else. And so you can't say that under equal protection of the 14th Amendment, that something happened to you specifically that happened because of race. And then you would be able to look at the 15th Amendment. And so it's really hard to go into federal court and to be able to jump through all of these hoops to finally get into a case where the court is going to maybe rule in your favor. One of the things that we did before 2013 is you maybe decided not to go into federal court. Maybe you decided to contact your members of Congress and maybe ask them to use the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to be able to preemptively come into your state. And so up until 2013, if you were in a state that had a long historical tradition of voting suppression and you had low voter turnout in the 1964 presidential election, the Department of Justice could actually go into your state when a law was passed, not when the law goes into effect, so you didn't have to worry about somebody being harmed first. And they could preemptively go in and they could say whether that law was going to be able to stay on the books. It was called pre-clearance. So if it was one of the states that had a history of voter suppression, they would be a pre-clearance state. And if they were going to change a voting law or an election law, they would have to go to the federal government and they would have to get pre-clearance for that to go forward. That is not the case right now because of a Supreme Court ruling in Holder versus Shelby County in 2013. And so the majority of the Supreme Court said that they felt that this was archaic. They felt that the issues of the past related to voter suppression in the South especially, but there were some other places. I mean, Chicago has had its issues, California had some issues, but in the cases with pre-clearance, what Chief Justice Roberts said is the issues of racism have kind of been dealt with. They're not there in the same way. And so if the Congress wants to keep doing pre-clearance, you need to have a different set of rules. You can't keep using these same rules. So they went down and they struck out this part of the Voting Rights Act, and they told Congress, unless you update that to reflect what's happening today, you can't use this anymore. So there is a way to fix the Voting Rights Act if Congress would go in and update it. But right now, you can't ask your member of Congress to use the Voting Rights Act under pre-clearance. All right, so let's look at some what ifs, some questions that were asked me. So I had a question that was asked, can I sue if I have to stand in line for a long time to vote? Isn't that a violation of my rights? Shouldn't I just be able to go and with a reasonable amount of time, get in and cast my ballot? Well, if you brought a case, it might be under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Could you say that your precinct had longer lines than maybe the precinct across town, so that resources were not equitably distributed across a state or across a county? The court would also then say, is everyone being disadvantaged equally? Is it because maybe your state legislature didn't provide enough money and maybe your state legislature just needs to provide more money. So that would actually be the remedy, is you need to work with your state legislature to fix this problem. That it's a legislative issue, it's not a judicial issue. And so the court would probably not rule in your favor unless you could show you were being harmed in a different way, you were being harmed in a way that related maybe to one of the amendments, and that it was something where it was a real harm and there was merit for you to go forward. Another question that oftentimes get asked, can I sue if I have to show a picture ID? And there's been a lot of contentious bills that have been put forward in states. There's a lot of states that do require voter ID, and they did have litigation. We've had some of these laws in the state of Nevada, but the last time some of these laws were put forward, our governor was Brian Sandoval, and he's a former district court judge. And so he did feel that a picture ID would be a violation of a poll tax, that you're charging people to vote. And so he said he would only sign one of those laws if the state paid for the person to get their ID. And so they brought the DMV in and they said, well, how much would it cost if the DMV was to facilitate getting everyone a certified picture ID? So helping them get their birth certificate and go through the whole process. And it ended up being a couple $1 million. And so the issue was dropped. But in cases where they do have voter ID, where it's gone through court cases and it was affirmed, they've asked, is the financial burden unreasonable? Does the state provide that type of assistance? Are there nonprofits, or does the legislature allocate a certain amount of money out? But again, the courts kind of feel like if the remedy is election should be managed by your legislature, the courts are really, really hesitant to weigh in on this when they really say to the people, go and talk to your state representatives, tell them you don't like this law, and have them pass new laws. That would actually be a better remedy than having the court come in an instance like this. And probably the last thing that I got a lot of questions on is, can I sue if there's no polling locations near me? Again, maybe a 14th Amendment violation is happening under Equal Protection Clause. And so again, a court would say, well, how is this burden being distributed? Is it just your precinct? Is it just your side of town? Is it just your county? And again, you oftentimes will see the courts talking about a remedy. Is a remedy the court getting involved, or is a remedy you should just elect different people and have them pass different laws? And so it's not that easy when you go into court to get a judicial remedy. Because even if the court finds that maybe a violation has happened, they still are very hesitant to what they call legislate from the bench. They say it's better that the legislature takes care of this, because that's actually what it says in the US Constitution. So let's look at state laws and state court. This confused a lot of people, because there was a couple of court cases here in Nevada, and 3 of them were filed in federal court and 1 of them was filed in state court. And so people were asking me, why? What is the difference? And it has to do with kind of, again, merit and standing. So if you're saying that your right was violated based on the US Constitution, that's going to be in federal court. But a lot of states have their own laws, and they have their own parts of their state constitution, which impacts voting rights and impacts elections. And so depending on which constitution or which laws you're going to look at, that's going to be where your jurisdiction is. And so when you're looking at maybe being able to pull something into a state court, you really need to be thinking about your state laws. And so when you're electing legislators and you're advocating for laws, make sure when those candidates are knocking on your door, or when you're going to meet and greets, bring up voting rights. Bring up, things that you think are important about elections, whether it's security, whether it's making sure people don't have to stand in line, making sure your candidates know you want them to protect voting rights, that you want them to protect the state constitution or the federal constitution. And then when these folks get elected, show back up, knock on their door, send them an email. Right now we're all zoom in on them, and say, it's me again. I'm still really, really interested in voting rights and making sure that we have good election laws. And then, really engage in the process. Be willing to volunteer and be a poll worker. Be willing to get your neighbors together so that you can go testify on a bill. Go do voter registration. You can't be a passive bystander when it comes to voting rights. It's not something that's just in the Constitution or in a law and then it's there and then we decide whether something is good or bad by measuring it. It really takes active participation. You really need to vote. You really need to advocate. And then if you're in a state like Nevada, and not all states have this, you can use direct democracy because we can do ballot initiatives here. It's in our state constitution that we can amend our constitution and we can actually pass laws outside of the normal legislative process. If you live in a state that has these direct democracy options, if you feel like you really aren't getting anywhere, sit down and talk with somebody who understands the process. Maybe start raising some funds to talk to an attorney about writing a ballot initiative. It can mean you having to just kind of seize the bull by the horns and amending your state constitution or passing a state law to make sure that voting is protected, to make sure that our elections are safe and secure. And then make sure if you live in a state where you elect judges, Nevada is one of those states, that you pay attention to your state courts. It's really easy to follow federal court because that's usually what's getting all the press. But when you've got local jurisdiction courts, oftentimes that's going to be the easiest place for you to win if you've got that state law, if your state constitution gives you that right. And so it's important if you elect judges, talk to them. Oftentimes people don't understand what a judge does, and so they get frustrated and just don't talk to them. I know in Nevada, I ran all kinds of Zoom forums where I encourage people to log in, ask questions of the judges, have judges explain what they do, talk about the different things that happen in different types of courts. Because in many instances, the thing that you need to get done may have jurisdiction locally, and it may be based on a state law, and it's going to be decided in your state court. Okay, now let's talk about the exception to the rule that throws everybody off and makes everybody confused. So every 4 years, we have presidential elections. So the questions that I get in presidential years are different than the questions that I get in the midterm or the off-cycle years. The Electoral College kind of breaks some of the rules that I've just explained. So when you were looking at presidential elections and you look back at the debates of the Constitutional Convention, if you look at things that the founders said after the Constitution was ratified, there's different arguments that are put forth about the Electoral College. One of the main arguments is, especially when the Constitution was ratified, is will voters actually have sufficient information? Are the candidates going to really be able to get out there and talk to everybody? Are the candidates going to be able to get from north to south and east to west, from the urban areas to the rural areas? So are voters really going to be informed? Now you might say we're kind of on information overload, but that was a concern back when the Constitution was written. That it creates equity among states so that you don't just have the larger states or the states that have more voters being able to always control the president and always control the federal government. That it removes passion from the process, that you're going to have people who can, with a calm mind and a centered outlook after the election happens, being able to sit down and look and see what happened. And it gives states kind of power without extending voting rights. That there were states in the South that obviously did not want to enfranchise their slave population. There's states in the North that didn't want to enfranchise women, but because the Electoral College is related to the census, how many people are counted in your census, not how many people have the right to vote, it also gives states rights, the people who run the state, it gives them power without actually extending voting rights to everyone who lives in the state. If you've ever been engaged in any type of presidential election now, you know that both political parties have what they call Electoral College math. And so they have strategies around the process, and it helps them to limit their focus. It helps them to limit spending. If you live in a state like Nevada, that's considered a battleground state, we got lots of visits by the presidential candidates. But then I always felt bad about the states that got no visits from the presidential candidates. So that's one of the problems that we currently have. People get confused when the loser wins in the Electoral College, which we saw that happen in 2016, because in our sense of democracy, we always assume that it's majority rule, but not with the Electoral College. And so I always have to kind of explain why sometimes the person that wins in the national popular vote doesn't actually become president. And so people will come to me. This happened in 2016, and it's like, well, can voters take action? We don't think this is fair. Is there a way to modernize how the Electoral College runs? Can it be eliminated? And they really feel that it is a limit on their voting rights. And so I have to explain to them, it's in the federal Constitution, it's in the US Constitution, if you want to get rid of it, you have to amend that document, which is a very arduous process. Now, there is a group out there that has a policy initiative called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, where they wouldn't be amending the US Constitution, but they would align electoral college votes with the national popular vote winner. And that's kind of percolating through the states. And a lot of people kind of would argue that's a way to modernize the electoral college without actually amending the document. But people do feel, especially when the winner doesn't actually win, that it is a limit on voting rights. Okay, so after this last election cycle, and there's still kind of lingering after effects, some people have said to me, why can't there just be a federal standard for voting rights? Why is Nevada different from Georgia, and Arizona is different from Michigan, and Virginia is different from California? It just seems so confusing. And it seems like people who live in some states, their rights are really protected. And then people in other states don't get that protection. I don't think that's fair. So shouldn't there be a federal standard for voting rights? And can there be a federal standard for voting rights? So if you look at going back the way we started, Article 1, Section 4, it does say the times, place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the place of choosing senators. So that is a place where the Congress, where the federal government does have some power and maybe could, if it wanted to, set a federal standard. That would be a way of Congress to say, we do have some right to do this. They could also look at the Supremacy Clause, where it says the US Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so therefore it stands above state constitutions, it stands above state law. And maybe look at the amendments and look at what some of the things that are happening in some of the states that feel like it's voter suppression. Is there a way for the federal government to maybe come in and intervene and to stop that? One of the ways they could do so would be to fix the Voting Rights Act, to fix that pre-clearance problem and do a legislative fix. So what I want to do right now is I want to talk about HR 1, which is also S1, that's pending right now in Congress. You've probably heard about it. It's called the For the People Act. Your members of Congress have probably been talking about it, but I want to explain what it is just a little bit, and then I'm going to stop the PowerPoint presentation and we'll look at some of the questions. So this is pending federal legislation. So what this is, it's an attempt to create some federal standards for voting rights. So it would create some national standards for voting registration. It says that every state has to have automatic voter registration at their Department of Motor Vehicles. It says they need to do same-day registration eventually. There are some rules that relate to elections and how that there has to be early voting, that there has to be certain standards for how many polling locations there are. Another thing that it includes is it creates independent redistricting commissions. But what's interesting is because of what I just read to you, so this part that's in the red, it means HR 1, which is also S1, says it's only for congressional districts. So the states have to have independent redistricting commissions, but only for their congressional districts. It can't be for anything else unless they have a state law or a state constitutional amendment that says redistricting commissions have to be used for all the maps. But that's the reason it says that is legally or constitutionally, the federal government doesn't have complete authority just to tell the states what to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop screen share and then come over here and look at the chat so I can get some of these questions answered.
Yeah. So I'd love to have you maybe address Alice's question first, which is,
okay,
what are the legal bases that states use to either preclude convicted felons from voting or make it difficult for convicted felons to regain their right to vote?
So this goes to the 13th Amendment. There's a documentary, if you want to watch it, Netflix still has it, called The 13th. And it does say in there that you can deny somebody the right to vote based on them being convicted of a crime. And so based on what the 13th Amendment says, the states have then used that to disenfranchise felons. Now, what ends up happening during Reconstruction and then after the end of Reconstruction especially, is they use the 13th Amendment and their ability to disenfranchise felons to basically disenfranchise Black men. So if you change your laws to make more things a felony, and then you say people who are convicted of a felony lose their voting rights, it was a way for them to get around the 15th Amendment. but it has to do with the 13th Amendment. Now, if your state wants to say, we are going to have a law or we're going to have a constitutional amendment for our state constitution that says we enfranchise our felons, that can happen at the state level. We just did that in Nevada with a law.
Great, thank you. And then the other question that's hanging out in the chat box here is a request to have you speak to the issue of non-citizens voting. So.
Right. So
yes.
I know that there's, I think San Francisco, trying to remember if there's any other states where they are allowing anyone to vote in, for instance, school board races, or maybe some local races. And the reason is if you look at what the federal constitution says, is that it allocates power down to the state legislature to make the rules. And then a legislature might allocate power down to a county commission or down to a city council, and then they're allowed to make rules. And so if the county commission has power and wants to say that they're going to allow anybody who resides in the district to vote, they technically have the authority to do that. There's nothing that would stop them unless somebody wanted to pass a state law or amend their state constitution to say that in their state only citizens can vote. If they have that power, they can do so.
Okay, great. Are there other questions that you all have just not posted in the chat yet? Feel free to type them now.
Any other questions? Okay.
You've posted a lot of really good things that I might bring up later in the next question time. So.
The next period is shorter because I'm going to talk about election security.
Okay.
Because a lot of the lawsuits that we saw filed in this last election cycle wasn't so much around a right to vote as it was around election security. I know there were at least 2 here in Nevada, so I want to talk about that a little bit and how that kind of impacts what we do with elections. Okay, so let me go forward a little bit here. Okay, so the security of elections. When you're thinking about the security of elections, you have to separate processes here. And oftentimes when we kind of go down the security of elections lane, people are talking about voting and casting a ballot. But really, if you talk to your election officials, whether it's your Secretary of State or an election board or whoever manages elections in your state, they spend a lot of time worried about the security of voter registration. Because one of the things that happened in 2016 is, if you remember, there was that hacking that was happening. There was those Russian actors that were trying to hack into our election system. They weren't trying to change votes. They were trying to erase voter registration files. And there was even, and I think it was in the state of Georgia, on the first day of early voting, their poll workers, their people who were setting up the election precinct got there, they were opening up their machines, and they were using poll books, which is a special type of laptop that has all of the secured voter registration information in it. They opened up the poll books and they had been wiped clean. And so they had to kind of panic a little bit, and somebody had to go and print out paper copies of their voter registration, because if they didn't have voter registration information, no one would be able to vote. And so it's important that when we're talking about election security, so let's say, you know, in the next election cycle, if the Secretary of State in your state runs elections and that's up for election, talk to that person about voter registration security. Talk to them about encryption. It's extremely important. So it's important to know in your state, when you're talking about voter registration, it's not just who we're allowing to register to vote, but who manages your registration records. Is it the Secretary of State? Is it a county official? Is it a member as a board of elections? You should know who's in charge of that and be aware of what they're doing. Where are the registrations stored? Is it on one server? Is it on multiple servers? Is it top down? Does it go from like the Secretary of State's office down to the county registrars? Or does it go bottom up? Does it go from each county up to the Secretary of State? Because that's what we do here in Nevada. And that caused us problems in the last election because it slowed things way down. Are those servers encrypted? And do the people who manage those servers, are they in contact with federal officials on a constant basis, knowing what the threats are, knowing where the hacking is coming from? And what are poll books? If your state uses poll books, you should know about this. Poll books are special types of laptops, which allows that encrypted data to be downloaded. But those are extremely important because if you're using poll books at your election site, whether it's election day or early voting, When you walk in, they need to be able to find you. If they can't find you in that poll book, they're going to say, sorry, you're not registered to vote. Here's a provisional ballot. And that can be scary because sometimes provisional ballots don't get counted. Each state is different. And that can be good and bad. I mean, for a lot of people, it's a headache trying to figure out all the different ways the states are doing things. Some are top down, some are bottom up, some have one server, some have 9 servers, some are encrypted, some are not. And people were saying before 2016, everything needs to be standardized. We need to regularize things. People didn't say that after 2016 when some states got hacked, because kind of the hodgepodge confusing nature we had made it a lot harder for hackers to have one hack to get at all of us. They were having to literally go state by state, server by server, county by county, trying to get past our encryption that each state was using that was a little bit different. So rarely do I hear people post 2016 say we should regularize the way we're doing voter registration. That maybe having a little bit of a difference is a good thing, but you definitely want to make sure that security is built into any system that you have. And so you need to make sure that those servers that you're using are very secure so that they can't be hacked. So that's part of security of elections that a lot of times we don't talk about, because a lot of times that stuff doesn't get litigated through the courts. You don't see lawsuits as much about that. What we do see lawsuits in is when it comes to voting and when it comes to the actual election process. And so in every state, you're going to have different types of voting. In the state of Nevada, we have full 2 weeks of early voting. We have vote centers. So you can go to any polling location and cast a ballot. You don't have to go to your regular precinct because we use poll books, and so it's faster. That means we have pretty much eliminated provisional ballots. Huge thing that got litigated this time almost in every state was mail-in voting. And in Nevada, we had no excuse absentee voting, which is mail-in voting, but you had to request it. And we've had it for a long time and it wasn't an issue. But then we went to universal mail-in voting, and then people started getting nervous because we had never done it before. There's also lawsuits between states that use paper, where you go in and you bubble it, versus states that use machines, which is what we do in Nevada, where you have like a tablet. Because with paper, people are worried about what happens to that paper when you can't see it. Machines, people worry, is it going to be connected to the internet? Can somebody go in and change the votes and we wouldn't know about it? The issues that you're regularly going to see litigation on are the votes being recorded correctly. And so sometimes you're going to have a candidate that's going to want to do a recount or have an audit because they're not quite sure that all the votes were counted correctly. Were there literal physical barriers to voting? I know there have been states in the past where the polling locations were not ADA compliant. People who had physical disabilities were not able to get in and cast a ballot, and that was a problem. Time barriers. In the state of Nevada, we actually have early voting sites that stay open 24 hours because we have people who work on a 24-hour schedule. And so one of our malls, you could go vote at 1 a.m. because that's when the shift workers are getting off. And so there are some states where they say, if you don't have weekend voting, or if you don't at least have one evening, it's going to be hard for people who have different working hours to be able to vote. Verification was a huge problem this time. This is where a lot of this litigation, because people wanted to know, how are you verifying the signatures on that mail-in ballot? What's the actual process that you're using? Margins of error. We had to have 2 recounts this time because there was 2 races that were within 100 votes. And so we had some really close elections and having to kind of figure out, well, when do you actually just call for a re-election? When is that margin of error so narrow that you call for a re-election? And then we had a problem here, and I know it happened in other states, with observers. People who wanted to be able to watch what the election officials and what the poll workers were doing, and sometimes they got out of control. Sometimes there was violence, sometimes there were threats. And while on one hand, our election officials want to be transparent, we had some people who were having death threats that were issued against them. And so it was definitely an issue that there were some people who were worried about security of elections that went beyond what would be considered legally allowable in registering complaints. So with voter registration, if you're just going to look at that part of security in a state, in some states you have what's called opt-in, where you have to proactively, if I want to register to vote, I need to fill out a form or I need to go online. And then at that point, someone vets me for eligibility. And then I need to make sure that my registration stays active so that I don't get purged. In other states, and Nevada's kind of moving in this direction, you do opt-out registration, where you get registered automatically when you go to the DMV and you get your driver's license or one of the certified IDs. And then unless you say no, you're going to get vetted and you're going to get registered to vote. But then the state makes sure that you're maintained. The state is going to proactively email you and say, hey, we're upping your registration. Do you want to, if you don't want to be registered to vote, let us know. If not, we're going to keep you registered to vote instead of purging you. We have a lot of states that are moving to online voter registration. Nevada does online voter registration. And people are trying to kind of weigh, is it better to have people fill out those paper forms, or is it better and more secure to have people registering online? I mean, we had some problems in Nevada where there were some folks that went out and did voter registration, and there were a couple of them that threw away all the Democratic registrants and a couple that threw away all the Republican registrants. And they said, maybe that's not the secure way to do it, to fill out the paper and hand it to somebody and then assume that they're going to faithfully return it in. And so maybe online voter registration is going to be better, but then you go back to this idea of you're doing it on the computer. Is it encrypted? Is it more secure? Making sure that people can't hack it. And then you want to have a discussion over who ensures eligibility. If you've got rules that it needs to be a citizen, you know, if you say that you have to live in the state for 30 days, you need to make sure it's very clear if you're doing online voter registration, exactly who's vetting to make sure that folks are eligible so that we don't have questions later about whether somebody committed fraud. And then same-day voter registration is becoming extremely popular because we can do so much with computers. A lot of states that are using the poll books that are able to look people up through the DMV or able to verify them right there at the polls, they're allowing same-day voter registration, but with a provisional ballot to make sure that you're not doing same-day voter registration in more than one county or more than one precinct. And so these are things that are really important that I don't think we talk about enough when we talk about elections and voting rights. But I encourage folks to make sure you are following along discussions related to voter registration, that you're talking to election officials, and that you're an active kind of advocate for making sure that your voter registration system has just as much security as your election system. I had some folks ask me about national voter registration because other countries do that, where you have a national voter registration process and a national voter registration database, and the federal government handles that, and then you don't have to worry about it at the state level. So if eligibility is the same regardless of residence, can the federal government assume this role? Would they be able to say to the states, you don't have that power, we're going to take it from you? What would be the constitutional basis for that? What would be is there a Supreme Court ruling that would give them that power? And then if voter registration, if that's being handled by the federal government and elections are being handled through the states and the counties, is that going to cause a problem when you're going through a pandemic and the state needs to kind of do things on the fly and the federal government's not sure what they're doing? And then can you really make sure that those records are going to be secure? If everybody's records are in one set of servers, is it going to be easier to hack that way instead of kind of the 50-state hodgepodge that we have right now? And so there's some pluses to a national voter registration database or a national voter registration system, but thinking through it, we're going to run into the same problems. Who has authority to make that decision? Would there be lawsuits? Would the states sue because they don't want to give it up? And would that functionally cause us problems during elections, especially when we have an emergency like a pandemic? Casting a ballot. This is part of the right to vote. So you need to be able to register to vote, and then you're going to cast that ballot. In many states, there's laws on the books at the state level that dictate how you are going to cast a ballot. So it's important to pay attention. Is your state the state that uses paper? So are you one that does the bubbling in and then it has the electronic scan, which is a good thing because then your record of voting is right there and you can physically hold it. So it allows for a good audit and it's visible. It does create a records management issue because if you live in a big state and you've got a lot of paper and it has to be kept for a certain period of time, you're going to have to find a space that doesn't allow for the paper to mildew. You're going to want to make sure that it's fire retardant, whatever building it's in, and that the moisture that's maintained in that building is kept in a way that makes sure that those records are maintained with fidelity. If you say, well, no, we don't want to do that, it would be easier to use one of the machines. It is easy to record and store votes that way. You can get machines that have a paper receipt. We do that in Nevada. You do see your vote. There's a receipt almost like what you get in the grocery store that comes through and you get to look at it and say, yes, that is the way I'm voting. It makes audits and recounts less expensive because it's easy just to run an audit on the machine. And it's not connected to outside influence. The machines that we have right now are not connected to the internet in any way, but it is less visible. It is harder for people to see where their vote is. It is harder when you're doing that recount. You know, if you're just running the computer program, people don't see their vote. It makes them nervous when they can't see that there's that piece of paper that represents you. The thing that we really had the debate on this time, usually it's about the machine voting, but this time it was definitely about mail-in voting. And it's important to understand that many states before the pandemic had absentee voting, where you would say, I want to opt in to using a paper ballot that I mail in because I'm going to be out of the state, or I'm with the military, or I'm disabled, or there's a number of reasons why you would want to do absentee. Many states have had absentee voting for a long time. Universal mail-in voting is where the state just emails everybody a ballot, whether they ask for it or not. Colorado, Oregon, Washington, that's just the way they vote. Everybody gets a ballot, you bubble it in, you either mail it in or you take it to a drop box. But a lot of states, because we were very nervous about the pandemic and people being infected with the virus, their state said, you know, let's for safety reasons, let's just send everybody a mail-in ballot. That way they can do it at home. They can just walk it out and put in their mailbox. They could drive it to a drop-off site. And then that way we don't have to put anybody's health at risk. But in states where you've never done that before, that meant all the rules and regulations for sending everybody a mail-in ballot was kind of done on the fly, which made people nervous. And then there was all kinds of questions about identification. Are you really sure you're sending that mail-in ballot to the right person? How are you actually verifying a signature if the last time I signed my driver's license was 4 years ago? Is my signature the same? Where are the drop boxes going to be? If I don't trust that the post office is going to deliver it, and that was an issue we had this time, where can I find that drop box? And then there was an issue here in Nevada, and it's an issue in some other states over what's called ballot harvesting. We have some Native American reservations in Nevada where people who live on the reservation have to drive for a couple of hours just to get to a post office, and they don't get their mail picked up regularly. And so they needed to be able to give their ballot to somebody they trusted, a family member, you know, somebody that was in their tribe, and have them securely drive all their ballots someplace to turn them in. We also had people, you know, who have disabilities. We had people who needed to be on lockdown because they were high risk for catching the virus. But there was a lot of unease about that, because it was an opening for nefarious actors to come in and do something bad. And so people, you know, right now, or even right now, trying to figure if that's something that we want to keep. So I'm going to end this way. I'm going to end the same way that we started. So do I have a right to vote? And again, do you have a right based on the definition? Is it legal? Is it based on a law? Yes. You know, we could answer that question again and say, yes, it's a limited right to vote. There's limitations, but yes, you have a right to vote. But what I would say is that's not the second question that, you know, the other question that you need to ask, in addition to, do I have the right to vote, is, do you know who decides if you have the right to vote? So if you feel that something is going wrong and you feel that your right to vote, even if as it's structured with those limitations, you feel that somebody is violating that right to vote, you need to decide. You have to know who decides whether your right to vote has been violated. So it's just as important, and it can be just as contentious as anything that's related to voting. So if you're having a problem, is it Congress you need to talk to? Is it your state legislature? Is this something that's risen to the level that it maybe needs to go into the federal courts, or maybe into one of your state courts? Do the people just need to organize and maybe do a ballot initiative? Or is it me and you? Do we need to use our vote? Do we need to use our voice and advocate to make sure that voting rights are protected? I would probably say all of the above. When you think that something has happened and you really feel like your right to vote, even with the limitations, has been violated, because it's something that we do consider to be sacred, and it's something that we consider to be very important. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing again and come back.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll see if there's questions.
Yes. So first question, many people believe the right to vote is extended only to citizens. What does the Constitution say? And do any states actually have constitutions that say otherwise? You mentioned a possible exception in a limited local case of school board elections.
Right.
So how might that be organized? So it's a multi-part question.
Yes, there isn't anything in the federal Constitution that specifically says only citizens have the right to vote. Again, it goes back to that. Once you set a national standard or a federal standard, you're going to end up fighting with the states because somebody's going to be doing something differently. And so it's one of those things that gets kicked down to the state level. Most states have voter registration rules that specifically say you have to be a US citizen, but that's based on what the state has said. Now, when it comes to federal elections, again, that's going to be your caveat, because with federal elections, you've got federal law that's going to impact whether somebody should be able to register to vote, and it's going to have to be based on citizenship. Where I have seen in very limited exceptions, and again, I think San Francisco is the one that sticks out, school board races, the water board races, things that are very local. So you're getting down to maybe a county election board where you may have a rule that says everybody that lives in this county gets to vote. And sometimes this is where they might say 16-year-olds get to vote, or they might throw something like that in, but it would be very limited local jurisdiction.
So I have a really kind of nuts and bolts question, and actually maybe a few, but okay, so I guess the question might be, at some point, depending on your state and your scenario, someone has registered to vote, whether it's at the DMV, whether it's at a high school voter registration drive, what have you. But when it comes to, you posed so many really good questions. How is it that voters need to take even step one to figure out, okay, I registered to vote, but now what?
It's a huge issue.
Yeah. Where does one find out how to do this, and what are the appropriate questions to ask?
So here's usually what happens in Nevada is we'll have somebody from California move in. And in California, they have what's called the top two open primary. So in Nevada, they don't have a closed partisan primary. Everybody gets to vote for everybody who runs in a primary. So folks from California will move to Nevada, not realize that every state does elections differently. They'll go to vote in the primary, registered as a nonpartisan, being told, sorry, you're nonpartisan, you can't participate. Then they'll call somebody like me and yell and scream because they think their right to vote has been denied to them and they want to sue. And that's an opportunity for me to go, hi, welcome to Nevada. We have different rules here. But unless you're running into something and you're complaining, it's not obvious that things are different state to state. And so usually it's when somebody runs into something that's different compared to the state that they used to live in, that's where they'll call the election board, the registrar, somebody like myself that puts my name and information out there. And they'll say, wait a minute, why do you guys do it this way? I'm from Colorado, we did it a different way. And then that's where I talk to them kind of about state jurisdiction and local jurisdiction, but it's not easy to figure out.
So is the best course of action for a voter in, say, Texas to just start Googling Texas voter laws and start there? That feels like it seems like so much effort is on the voter, but maybe
it is.
That's just the way it is.
So usually it's whoever manages your elections. And again, this is where it can be confusing. So in Nevada, it's our Secretary of State and our county election officials, so our registrars and clerks. If you go to their websites, you will see all the information related to voter registration and voting. But in other states, it might be an elected board that manages your elections, and it might be on their website. So what I would recommend, if you move into a state and you just can't find your election laws, look up your local community college, email any of the political science or history professors, they will show you, because I'm sure they're teaching a class where that stuff comes up.
That's a great step one. I love it. Patrick asks, could you address the prevalence or lack thereof of voter fraud? Is it as big of an issue as some people believe that it is?
So no. So we had, and this was probably the silver lining in having so many lawsuits in this last election cycle, because in many of the lawsuits, voter fraud is what was being claimed. And this is one of the good things that the courts do for us is there are people on the news talking about it happening. People were on social media talking about it happening. But when you go into a court, you have to prove it to the judge. So you have to show standing and merit. So you have to say, I was harmed in some way. So they were saying, we think there's fraud, therefore my vote was diluted. And we think, and here's why we think there was fraud. And they'll say, because there was mail-in ballots. And then the judge says, show me your evidence. And in every one of those cases, there was crickets and there was no evidence. And so I think it was a really good thing that we had as many court cases as we did, because in none of those court cases, in many different jurisdictions, many different states, there was not one shred of evidence that was submitted as a legal brief saying, here's the evidence of voter fraud. So that's what I say when people say to me, was there fraud? I would say we had a whole slew of court cases with different judges in different jurisdictions appointed by different presidents, and there was no evidence of voter fraud that was put on the record. None.
Great question. Thank you, Patrick. Okay, so Marshall asked a question, which I think is a good one to dig into, although his example is kind of fun. Okay, so the 26th Amendment prohibits the states and the federal government from using age as a reason for denying the right to vote to citizens who are at least 18. But would anything prevent a state from allowing younger residents to vote? And Marshall says all residents over the age of 6, which would be pretty entertaining.
So, I mean, technically, if you read that amendment, when they're talking about you can't limit the right to vote to folks who are over the age of 18. That's all it says. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say that you can be more generous and have 16 and 17-year-olds voting. It just does a limit and say people who are over the age of 18, you have to let them vote. And then again, if you're looking at other parts of the Constitution, you go back to it saying the state legislature gets to decide. Now, what you would have to do if you wanted people who are the age of 6 to be able to vote is to get that through your state legislature. And then depending on what your other state laws are and what your state constitution says, also possibly win litigation. Because if you have something in state law or in your state constitution, which does talk about age or something like that, that law can't be in conflict with it. And so it would be litigated in a local jurisdiction. But you would have to be able to get enough legislators to vote for having the age of 6 be the age. And if that happened, I would assume a lot of people would get recalled from their legislative position. But yeah, you could do it.
So, I guess this also begs the question of intellectual capacity. So is that also an issue when it comes to voting rights, that, people who might be deemed to not have full intellectual capacity in some cases may have their right to vote not allowed?
So that's interesting, because in the state of Nevada, part of our law that just got changed to manage this current election cycle because we were under pandemic conditions, we actually expanded out voter assistance. And so voter assistance can say, if it's somebody that is not proficient in English, and even if they have a Spanish language ballot, but they want some assistance in having something like a ballot question explained to them, that can happen. But it does even talk about people with mental capacity. If they would like somebody to help them by explaining what a ballot question or what's on the ballot, you can do that. Unless somebody has been adjudicated incompetent, though, they still have a right to vote.
Okay. All right, Sharon asks, is there something in place for states to check other states with regards to fairness of elections? That's a great question.
So every state is an island unto itself when it comes to these things, because again, if you look at the body of the Constitution, it says state legislatures decide. So if a state legislature is deciding, you only get to complain to the people that represent you. The people in another state do not represent you, so you don't have the right to complain to them. You can interact with and complain to the folks that you elect and the people who represent you, but you can't then say that you have standing in another state to complain over there. The person in that state, if you want to say I have standing to complain, they can only complain to the people that represent them constitutionally and legally. So I know that was brought up when the Electoral College vote was being counted, and you had people in some states saying that they wanted to overturn the election in other states. That would have been interesting if it would have landed in the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court would have probably said you need to mind your own business in your own state because you don't have standing to complain about what was happening in another state.
All right, so let's say that there is some sort of day of issue, because you've brought up a lot of examples where a suit is brought up after the fact.
Right.
But let's say that there is an issue that presents itself, for example, that that ADA, like there is no physical way for someone to get into their polling place. What can someone do to resolve that while they can still vote rather than waiting until they miss the opportunity?
Right. And so if there was an instance, and fortunately, we do primary elections before we do general elections. And so oftentimes an issue is going to come up in a primary election, which is much lower stakes than a general election. And that gives you enough time, even if you end up missing that primary election, to get an attorney and to litigate. But oftentimes, if you had something like that happen, where somebody in a wheelchair was being blocked from being able to cast their ballot, I promise you the ACLU would be all over that the same day that it happened. Or, if you had something related to, somebody thought that there was fraud happening, you would have attorneys on the other side that would immediately be showing up at the polls, because both sides tend to lawyer up when it comes to elections. And there's usually like hotlines you can call and talk to somebody. You can ask somebody to come out, and usually an attorney will come out and maybe make a recommendation for a way. Maybe that person can get an absentee ballot, even though they didn't apply for it, that would be an on-the-fly remedy so that there doesn't have to be a lawsuit. But usually it's going to have to be some attorneys that get involved.
Okay. All right. Question from Patricia. I assume no state would explicitly say that they don't want to limit people from voting. Would you care to comment on the Georgia laws? Do you feel that they will limit voting in certain populations under the guise of reducing fraud?
So I am assuming that there's going to be litigation, that there's going to probably be lawsuits. And when looking at the briefs when they get filed, they're going to have to make the argument that the changes in the laws are targeting a population, are specifically harming one group of people where they're not disadvantaged another group. And then if that's the case, is it limiting the right to vote based on race? Is it based on sex? I mean, where were you tagged to the federal constitution? Is it something in your state law, state constitution? But what I'm assuming they would do in this lawsuit is also bring up the fraud, that there's no, bring up the fact that there's no evidence of fraud. Okay. And so if they were trying to convince a judge, look, our neighborhoods in this last election cycle, people stood in line for 12 hours. We can document that. We had people that were there. We videotaped it. This thing happened. County next door, that wasn't the case. They had more polling locations. They were up longer. There was more machines. And then if they were willing, going to go the next step and say, and we also want to challenge the basis of this new law, because the other side has filed their briefs and they didn't provide any evidence of fraud. So if that's not really the reason, what is the reason? And so I'm hoping that it's going to get litigated. If the Voting Rights Act still had preclearance, Georgia would be one of the states where you could ask the Attorney General, you could go to a member of Congress and have the Justice Division come in. But because that hasn't been fixed, it's going to have to be litigated.
Sure. So a follow-up question from a different panel or different participant. Does any other state have voter registration rules similar to those being proposed in Georgia?
So it looks like there's actually a question above that about
there
cross-check.
Is.
Do you want me to grab that one first?
You can do either one. I was going with follow-up to Georgia, but if you want to deal with cross-check first, go right ahead.
So on cross-check, after it was examined on how they had it set up, it was not secure. They were not using proper data analytics. And so obviously there's a lot of Joe Smiths, there's a lot of Mary Jones. They were not in the data, they were not getting kind of down in the weeds enough to be able to clearly identify Mary Smith that lives in Georgia in Macon County compared to Mary Smith that lives in San Francisco. And so they weren't using best practices when it came to data management. There was too many instances of them accusing people of being registered to vote in more than one state when that was not the case. And so the courts quickly shut that down. But there is a program that's called ERIC. And that is a program that the states voluntarily join. And that is one of the states. I think there's 15 states that belong to ERIC right now. And what it does is it creates good data analytic connections between the states so that if I say moved to California and I turned my driver's license in, California then would immediately contact Nevada and say, hey, Sandra moved here. She just turned in her driver's license, cancel her voter registration. It also helps if someone passes away to make sure that you can take them off the voter rolls. Not all states are part of it though, but there's growing momentum to get all the states to connect. But it's run by election officials. It's not run by the partisan politicians. And so that's the big difference between ERIC and crosscheck. And then on Georgia. So does any other states have voter registration rules similar to what's being proposed in Georgia? Before this election, I would say no. There are some states that are mirroring the same changes that just happened in Georgia. I think Wisconsin is one of them. Minnesota might be another. Texas definitely is doing it. So there are other states right now who are mirroring the same types of restrictions on voter registration that we're seeing in Georgia.
So I guess that kind of leads to another question. So, we just had a presidential election. Next one won't be until 2024. But right. In between, we have redistricting that's going to take place as a result of the census results that will come out later this year. So do you have a sense, either from, your experience with previous census-based redistricting or based on the controversies around the last election, right. What are some changes that you expect to see between now and 2024?
So it's interesting because I was part of a group that we were running a ballot initiative here to get an independent redistricting commission. So we were running a constitutional amendment to amend the Nevada Constitution to take redistricting power from our legislature and to move it over into an independent commission. And we ended up having very interesting conversations about where does the right to representation lie? Because our legislature was trying to say that the right to representation is in the Constitution and it's solely their power. But yet in the Arizona case, so it was the Arizona State Legislature versus the Arizona Redistricting Commission in 2015, the majority, and it was actually Ruth Bader Ginsburg that wrote in that majority, said, no, the right to representation lays with the people. They have a right to fair maps. They have a right to representation. They have a right to make sure if they're electing people and they pass laws like taxes, it should impact them the same way. And so when we look at redistricting during a pandemic, things are going to be a little bit different this time, and we're not sure if it's going to have repercussions for the next 10 years. Normally, the census data would already be at the state level. That is not the case this time because of the pandemic. It was harder to get to those hard to reach populations. They got some extra time, wanted to make sure that everybody in every small town and Indian reservation and every nook and cranny had been counted. But then the Trump administration was also suing the Census Bureau to unmask people who were undocumented. Because if you look at that part of the Constitution, it's Article 1 where it talks about the census, it just says counting all people. It does not say citizens. Now it does say Indians not taxed, and it talks about 3/5 of all such persons, but that has been changed. We don't do that anymore, but it just talks about counting people. So the census counts people. And it does, in a way, registers who's documented and who's not, but it keeps that masked. It's confidential. And the Trump administration was trying to force the Census Bureau to release that information. So there was a big, hairy lawsuit that was going on all the way up until election, till Joe Biden actually became president, Inauguration Day, that immediately got dropped as soon as Joe Biden became president. He said, we're not asking for that information anymore. And then the Census Bureau said, well, we just wasted 6 weeks. We need extra time. And so the Biden administration said, well, how much extra time do you need? And they said, we need all the way till next September. So in the states, instead of getting the data in end of March, 1st of April, they're not getting the data until the end of September, 1st of October. There's already states where people are filing to run in local elections. We're happening right now. And they're having lawsuits over what data are we supposed to use? And the court's saying use the old districts. And then you're having some candidates ask if that's fair to them. And so there's a lot of litigation that's kind of ping-ponging around if your state elections are running into that deadline. And so in Nevada, if we are able to draw our districts in October or November, our next election cycle doesn't start until the following February. But everybody's nervous because they don't know when the data is going to come. They don't know if there's going to be holes in the data because of pandemic conditions and the lawsuit. So everybody's really nervous about, is that going to embed some type of problem into our redistricting maps now, which then are going to be our maps for the next 10 years.
Sure.
And so when you talk about voting in elections, you're also talking about the right to representation. And Emily and I were talking about the original gerrymander. You can look at that. It was in Massachusetts and it actually looks like a dragon. And I wish we called it a dragon mander. But the editorial that was written about that in 1812, when Elbridge Gerry did that, the editorial says, does the person in the eye of the salamander have the same interest as the person living in the claw? And the way it was drawn, obviously not. I mean, that issue is going to come up again if we inadvertently end up in weird districts and I'm on one side of the state of Nevada and I've got a district that's out way on the other side, and say, how do I in Las Vegas have the same interest as somebody in Pahrump that's way out in the rural areas? And so I think there's a potential for there to be a lot of lawsuits over the way that maps are drawn and there to be repercussions for the next 10 years as far as representation.
PJ has a question, but I also want to ask a follow-up. When it, now that we have had this vast experience with the mail-in voting at a nationwide level, do you feel like that's something that might come up more for other states going forward? Or is that going to be something that you feel like might just revert to the states that originally did it and everyone else will go a different direction?
The one thing I can tell you about Americans is we don't like to be told what to do. And every state is all over the place when they're doing whatever they want to do. And I think you will see, I think in a lot of states when it comes to local elections, especially things like school board, that's really where I see them saying everybody that lives here should vote, because schools and election and education elections are extremely important to everyone. That's where I can see them just saying everybody that lives here over the age of 16, because you're involved with schools, you get to vote. So I see it as being a very hyper local thing that would happen. The more you go up into elections for Congress and president, the higher you get up when it comes to governor, secretary of state, the stakes get higher. People are willing to litigate more. And so if you usually don't have as much wiggle room when it comes to your rules about who should be able to vote and where they're living. So where I see them just saying eligibility is just open to anyone would be more local, and it's going to be more related to issues like education.
So PJ's question, I think, was along these lines. So do you see voter eligibility and registration being extended to anyone living in the precinct as a result of the census? And perhaps you've already addressed that when it comes to more of the hyper-local elections versus perhaps the national elections.
Right. And so if I'm understanding the question correctly, when the census data comes out and whoever it is in your state that draws your maps, it might be the legislature, you might have an independent commission. They have to use the census data kind of as their foundation. They lay foundation with the census data. And then there's rules that they have to use. So communities of interest, they have to be compact and contiguous. You can't crack or pack when it comes to minority groups or people who identify with each other. And so when you talk about people who live in a precinct, the precinct is going to be based on the census plus the rules that we have for redistricting. So you might have a census area. You might have, the Census Bureau comes in and they might say, okay, here's a group of people who live close together, but they might not actually end up in the same precinct because they might have different communities of interest. And here's an example. So I live on the east side of Las Vegas, way on the east side. I live in a very old neighborhood. We have very large lots and we are zoned for farm animals. So I have a neighbor who has a pig. His name is Fred. I like Fred. We have chickens, we have horses. But then there are folks that live just a little farther to the east of us up on the mountain, Sunrise Mountain. And those are $1 million homes and they have HOAs and they don't like our farm animals. And so we sometimes become the Hatfields and McCoys when it comes to zoning because they would like to zone away Fred the pig and I don't want Fred the pig to go away. And so when I talk about drawing communities of interest, I always joke around and say the east side is two east sides. There is the Fred the Pig farm animals east side, and then there's the HOA east side. Do not put us together because we will not get along. But that would be an instance where it would look like we would naturally come together if you just looked at the map. But when you start digging down in, you're going to find that we have differences.
Sure. All right. And Marshall's question, I think, is an interesting one just to ponder over, but why should a non-citizen resident be denied participation in the government?
So even if you're not allowed to vote, you can still participate in the government. So even if you don't have a vote, you can still advocate. So we have a legislative session. You don't have to be a citizen or a registered voter to be able to get online and write to your legislator. You can go and do public comment. And even if you don't vote, you can still go to public forums during election cycles. You can still go out and talk at meet and greets. So even though we're maybe denying someone the right to actually cast a ballot, they can participate in, as far as a civics engagement perspective, as much as they want. And I actually encourage anybody. And that's why we say, when we talk about engagement, we don't say voters are engaging, we say the community engages. That anybody in the community should be engaged. So I would agree with you, Marshall, that if somebody lives in a community, they should be engaged.
That's such a great point. And I wondered, Sandra, if you wanted to mention, because so much of the next 4 years will probably be focused on the redistricting issue, you had mentioned that there's a couple of tools that really anyone can use to experiment with how lines are drawn. So do you want to mention that to the participants?
So talking about communities of interest, one of the things I'm working with college students and different kind of civic organizations is a program called Representable. So it's representable.org. It is a program that was created by graduate students at Princeton who work with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And once you get into it and you look at it, it looks like Google Maps on your phone. But what it is, it's the census blocks. And so I would type, go in and put my home address, and then it would zoom in and there would be my neighborhood. And then what I would be able to do is I would see the grid, I would see the streets, I would see the two parts of the east side. And I would go in and click, my neighborhood. And then I would write into that, I would say, this is the part of the east side that's older. We tend to have larger lots. We have farm animals down here. We don't have things in common with the people who live above Christie Lane. That's a different community of interest. But this allows people from the grassroots to tell legislators, see us. We don't want you to tell us what our communities of interest are. We're going to tell you. Maybe it's language, maybe it's an ethnic background, maybe it's a historic district. But it allows you to make your own map, write whatever you want about it, save it. You could send it to a civic organization like Vote Nevada, because we're going to compile ours, or you could send it to your legislator and say, here's my map. I want you to learn about me. So it's a very grassroots way. If you want to actually draw maps, there's a couple of free software packages. The one I always used is called Dave's Redistricting app. And you can go on there and it has tutorials for how to use it. It shows you how to download the census information, but it's the same type of software that legislators use when they draw maps. So the balance of power is shifted this time. 10 years ago, only the legislators and their attorneys had the software and the high-powered laptops. We all have that software available to us now. And all of it will download right to your home computer. And they have tutorials and you can draw your own maps.
I love that. So I certainly encourage anyone to check those out. Just, if anything, to have a greater appreciation for how challenging it can be for whether it's your legislative body or an independent commission to actually draw these maps. Goodness. And with that, we are up against our time. It's 8:30 on the East Coast. And once again, the 90 minutes has gone so quickly.
Really fast.
So for all the participants, thanks for staying with us. And I also want to remind you that we'll be posting the video to this and all of our previous sessions at the montpelier.org website. And so particularly with the presentation today, there is so much information there that you really might want to revisit and share with someone else. You're absolutely welcome to share any of these presentations with as many people as you like. And we will be sending out a survey to all of the folks who participated in the 6 Weeks Toolkit series, because we would love to know what else you're curious about so we can offer more programs just like this. So once again, thank you for the co-sponsorship to the Center for Civic Education. And thank you so much to Dr. Cosgrove for wrapping us up with the incredibly important right to vote discussion.
This has been awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.